All right, Alexander, let's talk about the missile strike outside of Donetsk at this facility, school, where Russian soldiers were staying at the town of Makeyevka. The Russian Ministry of Defense, they have issued a statement, an official statement, and they put the number of dead at 63. And we're getting varied reports as to the total casualties. I've heard around 160, 65 plus, say. And then you have the narrative coming out of the Ukraine side of things, where they're putting numbers of around 300 to over 400. So that's pretty much just a basic summary picture as to where we stand as of this moment. President Putin has ordered an investigation, and he wants the results by January 6th. And the Russian Ministry of Defense, actually the entire Kremlin, they are making a point in all of their statements to say that these are American or U.S., or what was used, the weapon used was American or U.S. HIMARS missiles. It's just interesting that they're making sure to emphasize the fact that the missiles were of, according to the Kremlin, the Russian Ministry of Defense, that the missiles were American in the HIMARS systems. That's where we are. What's your take on this?
Well, that is indeed where we are. Well, can I say straight away, first of all, that I have absolutely no doubt that the Russian figures that we're getting are accurate. I mean, you correctly said 63 dead was what the Russians spoke about yesterday, but that is only a provisional figure. Obviously, other people have been wounded. Some of those, unfortunately, are going to die of their wounds. And there's also bodies, no doubt, under the rubble. They will find them. And I think, that this figure of 160, probably dead and injured, will probably be about the correct figure, which I'm told, I'm not a military person at all. I don't know very much about military units, but it's a company. It's a company of troops, apparently, with their attendant equipment. They were stationed in this vocational school. There's rumours, and we've only got rumours, that what happened is that somebody used a mobile phone. It was New Year's Eve. Perhaps they were calling friends. Perhaps they were calling family to extend New Year's greetings. That may have been picked up by Ukrainian or Western directional finders, and that led to a missile strike. Now, the Russians claim 6 HIMARS missiles. 2 were shot down. 4 got through. So if you're going to use 6 missiles to attack one place, that must mean that you know what is there. I mean, that's a large number of missiles, expensive missiles, to be used against one particular facility. So clearly, whether or not this story about the mobile phone is correct, the Ukrainians knew what they were striking at, and there was clearly a major security leak. Now, there's also, and I'm sure you read all of this, lots of angry statements from Russian people, commentators about, why were all these people concentrated in one place? The Russian Defense Ministry says this was a temporary location. I think we just have to wait and see what the official explanation is, if we do ever get one. But for me, the big story about this incident, the thing that makes it different, is that the Russians are providing information about it. Now, you go back earlier in the war, and I was thinking in particular of that incident, right back in May, when there was a attempt by the Russians to cross a river, the Seversky Donets River. Some of their troops were then caught in the open by Ukrainian artillery fire. There were similar claims of Ukraine with hugely exaggerated numbers. 600 Russian soldiers allegedly had been killed in one go. People then did, examine the drone footage and said it probably wasn't that many. It was probably around 150, similar to the number that we're probably going to get from Makeyevka. The point is that the Russians maintained total silence about that story. They didn't discuss it. They didn't say anything about casualties. That allowed rumors to feed on themselves. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry, the Kremlin, seem to have understood that that kind of silence, that kind of secrecy, simply doesn't work in this kind of war with today's Russia. And instead, they're becoming much more forthcoming when incidents like this happen. Now, as to what it means for the war itself, it's a terrible tragedy. It's a tragedy for the people who were killed. It's a tragedy for the people who were wounded. It's a tragedy for the families of these people. There's already been ceremonies in some of the towns, like Samara and Tolyatti, where they came from, but it's not going to change the outcome of the war. And it's just an incident of the kind, I'm afraid, that happens in war all the time.
What does this mean for the Kremlin?
Yeah, I mean, what it means to the Kremlin is that they will have to deal with the repercussions. If there's been a lapse, a security lapse, they will have to find the perpetrators. If there was, somebody used a mobile phone, that will need to be explained. There will need to be a tightening up on security. Some people will no doubt have to be punished, but it will not change the Kremlin's policies. I mean, can I just say, I think this is a point that I would say about Russia. This is a country which, when it resolves to see a war, tends to stick by its course. If you go back 20 years ago, 10 years, 15 years ago, to the time of the conflicts in the Caucasus, in Chechnya, there were lots of incidents of this kind, and they never distracted the Russians from their objective. They continued with the war right through, and I think this is exactly what this incident is going to do. I don't think the Russians will be thrown off course by it, but they do understand that they have to acknowledge what happened. They have to show that they have concerns for the victims, the people who died, and for their families. And we can already see the Russian authorities taking steps to address that problem. That is a major change historically from the previous pattern of Russian approach to this kind of thing. I mean, in previous wars that Russia has fought, you never got any admission from the Kremlin ever that there had been any losses at all. This time, it's different. And that is a sign, perhaps, of how much Russia has changed.
Right. Well, I was thinking more along the lines of the political capital, say, for the Kremlin,
Oh, yeah.
for Putin himself.
Yeah, I
Because
get
once
your
again,
point.
you're
Yeah.
getting a lot of analysis from the Russian channels. And you always get this when you have this type of incident take place, whether it was
Yes.
for the Kerch Bridge or, say, the Moskva or any of these other incidents that happened here, Kherson or Kharkiv. You get the discussion about, was this the right strategy, going soft, going slow, what's going on, why were these troops positioned so close to the front lines, to the line of fire. I mean, you start getting a lot
Yeah.
of the questioning of the strategy. Now you have Surovikin, who's
Yes.
commanding everything. So, I think that adds another interesting layer to the analysis as to why did this happen, and
Yes.
what are the political implications for the Kremlin, and then what does this mean for the collective West? I mean, I
Yes,
imagine
indeed.
this is
Yeah.
going to fuel their hope to get regime change, more money, more weapons. Ukraine
Yes.
can do this. They can punish Russia. They can give Russia,
Yes.
as Lloyd Austin said, a bloody nose. So we need to pour more into this
Yeah.
this effort and this policy.
Yes. Well, there is a lot of discussion and criticism in Russia, and there always is, by the way. I mean, this is another thing. I mean, you follow Russian Telegram channels. I follow Russian Telegram channels. I mean, these people are a lot of them, very, very critical of everything that's done throughout the battle, the war. They criticize the Kremlin, they criticize Putin, they criticize the Russian high command. So far, by the way, they don't seem to be criticizing Surovikin, and he doesn't seem to be specifically criticized for this particular incident. Though, who knows, eventually that might change. But these people are very critical all the time. And, you get people like, Gherkin, the Strelkov, as he's sometimes known, he writes things about this kind of thing. And again, you get lots of criticisms. But I don't think this makes any fundamental difference to the politics of this. You look at Putin's poll ratings, they seem to be quite steady. I don't think it's going to change things in that respect. I don't think it's going to change mood or feeling in Russia. It might harden it. It might put more pressure on the Kremlin to take a harder line in the war. But I don't think ultimately it is going to make a huge amount of difference. But there are the two other points that you made. Firstly, in the West, well, they will use this. I mean, there hasn't been any success from Ukraine now for many weeks. I mean, Kherson, the recapture of Kherson was the last big success Ukraine achieved, and that was weeks ago. The front lines are stagnating. All the indications are that Ukraine is losing lots of men and lots of people in many places, and they are short of victories. And attacking one particular place on New Year's Eve too, by the way, killing a lot of Russians. Well, that's a kind of victory, so you can play that up, and you can say, well, look, Ukraine is able to hit back. They're able to cause the Russians damage. There might be some pressure, therefore, to continue the arms supplies. I mean, the NATO military leaders are going to have a meeting fairly soon. They might be saying, well, look what Ukraine is able to do with these HIMARS systems. Let's give them even more. But again, I have to say, I think that pressure is there all the time. And the more interesting thing, and this is what the Kremlin is going to do, is you were absolutely right at the start of the program in saying that the Russians have been making very big play about the fact that HIMARS missiles were used in this strike. And if you look at what the Kremlin has been saying, what the Russian information machine has been saying, what Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said in a huge interview he gave for Russian television on the 28th of December, they're hammering away at the point that this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine anymore. It's a war between Russia and the West. The West is trying to undermine and divide Russia. It's using Ukraine to do it. This is an existential war for Russia. And the fact that American missiles were used in this strike, of course, plays directly into that narrative, especially given the fact that there are large numbers of reports that many of these American HIMARS strikes in Ukraine are controlled and guided by the Americans themselves. So that I suspect the Russians are going to play with. The Kremlin is going to play on continuously. They're going to say, look, the reason we're suffering these losses, the reason we're having to fight this war is not because of Ukraine. It's because behind it, there is the West, the collective West, the United States. They're pressing against us all the time. And you can see the proof. Look what they've just done in Makeyevka.
Yeah, the precision missile strike is going to play very nicely. I know the pressure is on every day for longer range missiles or for more advanced missiles to be given to Ukraine, but this is going to play very nicely to the neocons, the Lindsey Grahams, the Blinkens, the Newlands, who are constantly making that case, because now they can say, you see, we we succeeded in a precision missile strike. We did a lot of damage. Just imagine if Ukraine had X amount of these missiles and equipment and all of this these tools to hit at the Russians. They can strike deeper into Russia. They could do more damage to Russia. That would lead to more instability in Russia, and that would weaken Putin's position, his approval ratings. Eventually you get to the regime change. I mean, that it's really this really does make their case to get the weapons that they've been calling for to Ukraine, these deadly weapons to Ukraine, and that will eventually lead to Russia's surrender on U.S. terms and an eventual regime change in Russia. Because, look, with these precision weapons, look what we did, and that's just one case, that's one instance. So, I mean, it plays, in my opinion, that's how the neocons are going to play it. That's how I can imagine them playing it. And I think it will resonate. I mean, I think I could see a lot of Republican congressmen and senators and a lot of Democrat congressmen and senators. I could see them just nodding their head and going, "Yeah, absolutely. This, I see it. Okay, let's approve. Let's approve weapons. Biden White House, let's approve it." I mean, everyone will get on board. Address that, and then what you said about how the Kremlin's going to use this, the fact that these are American HIMARS, the way they're framing the narrative, the messaging by saying American or U.S.-made HIMARS, MLRS, and that's across the board, across all the statements from the Russian government as well as Russian state media. There's two ways that you can look at this. Maybe there's more ways, but I can think of two ways. The first way is that Russia is saying, look, we're fighting NATO, we're fighting America. That is why we're going so slow and we're not, making the gains that, everyone is thinking we should be making. So they could use that as a crutch, as an excuse, in a way. It could be the reverse. They could be signaling that, look, you see, we are fighting the U.S., we are fighting NATO, so now we're going to really go hard. I mean, we are going to really hit hard at Ukraine, at command centers, at centers that are housing foreign mercenaries, foreign troops. Who knows? I mean, the case can be made for Russia, for American weapons. The case can be made that these are preventing Russia from making gains, or it could be used as an excuse to take the gloves off for Russia. I don't know. Maybe there's more to the narrative or the framing, messaging of this.
Right. Let's address the two things, because actually I think this is very important. It's the most interesting part of this whole thing, because as I said, the Makeyevka incident in itself, as part of the battle, the actual war that's going on, tragic though it is for the people involved, is not, I think, a big event. I mean, if you look at it from the other side, Russian missile strikes across Ukraine, lots of Ukrainian soldiers get killed every day from Russian missile strikes. The reason we give this attention to this one is because, firstly, the Russians have suffered, they had their losses, and of course, they're unlike the Ukrainians, they're talking about these losses. So but we mustn't think this is going to change the battle. But the political battles happening both in Washington and Moscow, they're very important. Let's talk about Washington first. You're absolutely right. The neocons are already seizing on this. They are also, by the way, the British neocons, if you like, who, of course, part of the same group. They're also seizing on this. There's lots of things, Ukraine is, able to fight. It's able to inflict these losses. We should give them more weapons. We should give them ATACMS missiles so they can hit deep inside Russia. We should give them fighter jets. We should give them Patriots. We should give them everything they possibly want. And our objective should be victory. And there is a very disturbing and rather unbalanced article in the New York Times by a British person, by the way, a British neocon, says, forget about Russian red lines. Russia doesn't have red lines. There's no such thing as Russian red lines. We can do whatever we want. We can enlarge, we can attack, we can invade Crimea, even though there's just been an admission today that there are actually nuclear weapons located, Russian nuclear weapons, permanently based in Crimea and always have been. So we can attack anywhere we like. We can do anything we want because the Russians, they're just bluff. they're never going to really respond, and that's what we should do. Now that's one side of this argument in Washington, and they're going to try and use this Makeyevka affair, and it's one more part of the claims that they're going to make. And as you correctly say, there are neocons or neocon inclined people on both the Democrat and Republican side, and they will, these things will resonate with them. But there is the other side as well, and it's clear to me that it's principally now to be found in Washington itself. And it's very interesting, for example, that with the Patriot missile delivery that we were hearing so much about, with every day that passes, we see a systematic attempt by various officials in Washington to make it clear that this is not a particularly big deal. So now we're being told that system isn't actually going to be delivered to Ukraine until next year. That is 2024. That only one battery will be provided and no more than that. That it's going to be in a fixed location, which makes it an obvious target, and that they've apparently provided written assurances to the Russians that there will be no US personnel of any kind, apparently, operating this system, that it'll be entirely Ukrainians. So somebody in Washington is trying to exercise some degree of restraint. They're trying to prevent long-range missiles like the ATACMS being delivered. When a decision is made to send Patriot systems to Ukraine, somebody steps in and tries to neuter that to the extent that they can be. So there is push and pull. And there are many reasons for this. Firstly, the Pentagon is worried that most of its, arms supplies are getting depleted. They don't want to see more HIMARS missiles. There's apparently already now a shortage of HIMARS missiles. There's going to be there's also a shortage of Patriot missiles. They don't want them all going to Ukraine, leaving the Pentagon exposed if there's conflicts in other places. All sorts of there is that concern as well. But there are also political concerns, and that I have absolutely no doubt. And some people, Biden himself admitted when he was hosting Zelensky that European leaders have told him in unequivocal terms that they're prepared to go all the way, except that they're not going to go. There's one point that they will not go to. They do not want to get or be drawn into a direct confrontation, a military confrontation with the Russians. And that is obviously also a constraint as well. And then there is a third constraint, which is a political one, which is that you are seeing increasing numbers of Republicans, especially in the House, rebelling against this policy. You had situations where people like Representative Jim Jordan, and people like that, they refused to applaud when Zelensky addressed Congress. So you're having a push-pull type situation in Washington, and it's clear that the neocons are running into some resistance. So this Makeyevka affair will work to their advantage to some extent, but I don't think you can take it too far. And I don't think it's a particularly big incident in itself. And I think that it won't decide the argument that is going on in Washington, and which is clearly happening all the time. Now, in Moscow, It's the other way around. You have the Kremlin, which has been trying to conduct this war in a very methodical, very systematic way from around April, May, when it became clear that Ukraine was not going to compromise, that the negotiations in Istanbul failed. They've been taking a very incremental approach to this war. They don't want Russia to experience massive casualties. They clearly want to build up Russian military and crank up military production. So they're wanting to take an incremental, step by step approach to this war. And there is always pressure in Russia, and it's pressure, a lot of it coming from the public, the Russian public. Why are we allowing these things to happen? Why are we letting Donetsk get shelled every day? Why are we letting our people die in places like Makeyevka? We should take stronger action. We should avenge the deaths of these people. We should hit the Ukrainians harder. And I get to say this, I think the Kremlin does respond to this. And quite apart from the fact that we've now seen these constant Russian missile barrages across Ukraine that really began in October, the very latest Russian missile barrages are now starting to target NATO facilities in Ukraine. And you saw an attack, for example, on the Alphavita Hotel in Kiev, which supposedly housed Western contractors, mercenaries, and people like that. We've had Lavrov saying, we know where the CIA people are located in the SBU building. We know about the military attaché office, the American military attaché office in Ukraine. We've had Putin saying, if there are the Patriot system is 100% a target, and clearly signaling if Americans are involved in trying to operate that system, they're a target too. So gradually, steadily, incrementally, the Russians are hardening their position also, partly, no doubt, for military reasons, but partly because of this pressure that is always there and which is no doubt growing.
Final question. Throughout this conflict, there have been military analysts who have claimed, military experts and analysts who have claimed that Russia absolutely knows that there are NATO commanders located in Ukraine, and
Yeah.
they are essentially operating, they're quarterbacking the conflict. And there were back channel agreements, let's just say, according to many of these experts,
Yeah.
from both sides, from the Russian side, from the European and the American side. There were back channel agreements which allege that Russia was to not touch these command centers, and even Medvedev has alluded to these command centers, that Russia should not touch these command centers, and these command centers would manage the war so that events like what happened over New Year's do not happen. Do you believe in these theories, this analysis that there was this type of agreement? And if you believe in it, do you think this type of back channel agreement for the Russians to not target the command centers will continue to hold?
Right. I think I believe in it up to a certain point. I think that there are discussions going on. Lavrov, again, in that big interview, did say that that the Russian embassy in Washington is still operating. They still have contacts with the Americans. They still obviously have some ability to sort of speak with people in Washington. And from a Russian point of view, one can see the attractions because it gives them leverage to some extent over what the Americans do. They say to the Americans, look, we know you're there. We know where you are. Lavrov, as I said, was identifying where they were. We know where you are. We will not come after you if you don't do certain things. So, of course, if you send Ukraine ATACMS missiles, for example, which can go deep into Russia, if you send them very advanced Patriot missile systems, if you do that kind of thing, well, then we will retaliate and we will come after you. So it gives the Russians some degree of leverage. But these things tend to be extremely unstable. And in a particular conflict like the one we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, and with the Ukrainians, with the neocons pushing all the time for whatever constraints there are to be thrown aside, you can easily imagine that any kind of implicit agreements. They were also very much the case in Syria, also, by the way. Implicit agreements like that can break down and can break down very soon. Now, Lavrov, he gave a huge interview and he said, that we are currently planning an interdiction campaign. We're not just going to go for the energy infrastructure and the railways, we're also going to go for tunnels and bridges. We got sort of plans for that. That's essentially what he was saying. Bridges over the Dnieper, maybe? Who knows? But probably, eventually, we will see an escalation from the Russians. They will perhaps try to keep things in balance with the Americans to some extent. But clearly, there are red lines. Clearly, there are rules. But in this kind of game, rules like that can collapse and have no meaning and can do so very quickly. And I don't believe they will hold.
Yeah, it already seems that they're collapsing. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, then the Duran.locals.com. Look for us on Rockfin as well, and the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.